You work, you save, and yet the math stops making sense. You walk into a grocery store, and the price tags tell a story of money that seems to be shrinking faster than you can earn it. For a long time, the global economic order relied on something physical to keep those prices stable: gold. Because gold is difficult to pull from the ground, its supply is predictable, strictly limiting how much new money enters the system. But the 20th century demanded more flexibility. Economists like John Maynard Keynes argued that governments needed to actively manage their economies to prevent depressions. In response, nations abandoned the gold standard in favor of fiat currency, money issued by the state with no physical anchor. This flexibility gave governments the power to fund massive infrastructure projects and social programs. But that power requires central banks to actively expand the money supply, a lever that often triggers heavy inflation and deep cycles of boom and bust. That reality is creating a profound crisis of trust. With purchasing power actively eroding, people are looking for alternative ways to store their wealth, completely outside the reach of traditional centralized control. This graphic maps out to two completely opposing financial philosophies available to us today. On the left, we have the digital standard, specifically the concept of decentralized cryptocurrency like Bitcoin. Advocates of this approach point out that an algorithmic money supply eliminates the risk of human manipulation. Because there is no central authority, the scarcity of the currency is mathematically guaranteed, shielding it from arbitrary devaluation. On the right is the traditional macroeconomic perspective. Proponents here argue that complex modern societies cannot function on autopilot. They require state intervention to route resources, smooth out recessions, and maintain collective stability. To achieve that structural stability, the state requires strict rules. It demands regulatory compliance, taxation, and direct control over how capital behaves in the market. This leaves you with a direct choice. You can prioritize absolute individual autonomy, accepting extreme market volatility as the cost, or you can choose the familiar structure of state management, knowing the price tag is inflation and institutional control. This matrix compares how these systems generate money. First, monetary policy. Bitcoin is programmed to stop producing coins at exactly 21 million. This hard cap protects against inflation, but offers zero flexibility. If banks need immediate liquidity, the algorithm won't print money. Fiat currencies handle this differently. Central banks have the explicit authority to inject new capital to stimulate a stalled economy or rescue failing industries. That emergency lever keeps the immediate crisis at bay. But it floods the market with new currency, diluting the value of money in your account. An algorithm gives you perfect predictability over time. A central bank gives institutions the flexibility to prevent a total collapse today. Now, consider what happens when you need to move your wealth internationally. Because cryptocurrencies operate on a peer-to-peer network, transactions process independent of geography. You can send value anywhere in the world, bypassing exchange controls to achieve total financial sovereignty. But true sovereignty means absolute responsibility. No central authority to reverse fraud, no insurance covering a lost password, and one mistake means permanent loss. State-managed money prioritizes national stability over individual mobility. Governments enforce exchange controls specifically to prevent sudden capital flight and protect their domestic economies. In many developing markets, these policies create severe bureaucratic friction. Citizens find their wealth legally trapped inside a depreciating local currency, effectively paying the price for the state's broader economic goals. It comes down to this: you navigate layers of state bureaucracy that restrict your capital, or you embrace a borderless system where you are entirely on your own. This brings us to the final matrix row: scaling to support society. Bitcoin functions effectively as a pristine reserve asset, but its rigid architecture physically struggles to process the millions of microtransactions a global economy demands every second. Furthermore, an exclusively algorithmic approach ignores human reality. Economic behavior is messy, driven by socio-political power dynamics and inequalities that code alone cannot address. Traditional macroeconomic frameworks argue that complex societies require flexible money. States use that flexibility to issue debt, build infrastructure, and fund long-term industrialization. The vulnerability here, however, is human nature. Because the state is integrated with the money supply, it becomes highly susceptible to corruption and mounting public debt. A decentralized network cannot pour the concrete for a new hospital, but the central bank will inevitably devalue the currency required to pay for it. When you place these systems side by side, the reality becomes obvious. There is no flawless financial utopia. Bitcoin offers a mathematically sound escape from institutional failure, yet assuming it will seamlessly replace global banking ignores steep technological and behavioral hurdles. On the other hand, trusting entirely in fiat currency ensures a slow, mathematically certain decline in your actual purchasing power. Protecting yourself means looking closely at your specific circumstances, your risk tolerance, and deciding exactly what you are trying to optimize for. The decision isn't about finding the objectively perfect system. It's about deciding which set of systemic flaws you are most equipped to manage. Looking at this decision tree, we can map out a few practical strategies. First is the sovereign optimizer. If your primary fear is inflation and you demand absolute independence, your path leads towards decentralized assets. You gain true ownership of your wealth, but must stomach intense volatility and manage your digital security without a safety net. Next, the policy pragmatist. If you value institutional safeguards and legal recourse, your path stays within traditional fiat and equities. You benefit from systemic stability and lower day-to-day volatility, but you must accept the hidden, ongoing tax of inflation and capital controls. Finally, there is the emerging market citizen, someone dealing with a rapidly failing local currency, but still navigating a rigid domestic economy. This requires a hybrid approach. You hold decentralized assets to preserve your capital and cross borders, while maintaining enough local fiat to buy groceries and pay taxes out of daily necessity. Ultimately, your personal financial standard represents the specific set of systemic trade-offs you choose to navigate in the modern economy.
Welcome to the debate. So I want you to imagine a traveler walking through Johannesburg Airport.
Okay.
In their pocket, they have zero cash. In their luggage, well, it's just clothes, nothing else. But in their head is a 12-word poem that holds $10 million.
Right. A seed phrase?
Exactly. And they just walk right past customs. I mean, how exactly does a state enforcement officer tax a memory?
It's a pretty wild scenario, yeah.
It is. How does a government mandate the repatriation of an asset that fundamentally, doesn't exist in physical space? And that brings us to our topic today, this really profound collision between decentralized digital currencies and traditional state financial controls.
Right, and we're drawing on a really rich body of material to explore this today. We'll be looking at Saifedean Ammouz's analysis in The Bitcoin Standard, the South African Treasury's draft capital flow management regulations of 2026.
Along with Duncan MacLeod's critiques of those exact regulations, yeah.
Exactly, and also some deeply insightful academic work on the cultural foundations of African economic development plans, like the Lagos Plan of Action and NEPAD.
So the core question we really have to answer is, does the borderless cryptographic nature of decentralized digital currency render traditional state-imposed exchange controls obsolete? Or do governments still possess the tools, the mandate, and, frankly, the systemic inertia to regulate digital wealth effectively?
Right.
I take the position that decentralized assets represent an unstoppable, technology-driven shift toward individual financial sovereignty, which basically nullifies traditional state controls.
And I contend that this utopian vision drastically underestimates the enduring capacity of state regulation. Governments still have the analog tools, the technological hurdles are real, and there's a profound inertia in human economic systems that you just can't ignore.
Well, let's start with the sheer mechanics of enforceability, because honestly, this is where the state's traditional playbook completely falls apart.
I don't know if it completely falls apart, but go on.
I mean, what we are witnessing with Bitcoin and decentralized cryptocurrencies is a paradigm shift to true, quote-unquote, sound money. Amos details this beautifully in his work.
He does make a strong case for the architecture.
Right. Bitcoin's algorithmic scarcity, its hard cap of 21 million coins, and its decentralized ledger provide this democratic alternative that is inherently immune to fiat manipulation and inflation. And because of that, legacy capital flow regulations are functionally unenforceable.
But that assumes the state just gives up.
Well, look at the South African Treasury's 2026 draft regulations. They are attempting to replace these archaic 1961 apartheid-era rules, but they are trying to regulate a network protocol as if it were a physical stack of Krugerrands.
Right, they want travelers to declare if they hold crypto assets above a certain threshold.
Yes, and giving enforcement officers warrantless powers to search individuals and inspect mobile phones at borders, which is honestly absurd on its face.
It's heavy-handed, sure.
As the economist Dawie Roodt so perfectly illustrated, crypto is just information. It's essentially the same as a WhatsApp message. You can carry a hardware wallet seed phrase entirely in your memory, so state attempts to force 30-day declarations or mandate repatriation are functionally irrelevant.
Okay, but the idea of a traveler walking through a border with a secret password in their head is a great thought experiment. It really is. But it ignores the brutal reality of how state coercion actually functions.
How so?
The state doesn't need to read your mind to enforce its will. We have to talk about the $5 wrench attack.
Right, the old cryptography joke.
Exactly, but it is deadly serious in practice. The premise is that it doesn't matter if your digital vault is secured by billions of dollars of computational encryption. If a state enforcement officer can simply put you in a jail cell and hit you with a $5 wrench until you hand over the keys.
That's a bit extreme, don't you think?
The state uses analog tools on human bodies. That is its ultimate leverage. The Treasury's draft regulations propose up to a 1 million rand fine and 5 years of imprisonment for noncompliance.
Yeah, the penalties are incredibly steep.
Right, and the threat of a prison sentence alters institutional and consumer behavior long before a border search ever happens.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. That implies a level of totalitarian enforcement that is simply unsustainable at scale. Think about Duncan MacLeod's analogy regarding rooftop solar in South Africa.
Okay.
It's a brilliant parallel. When the centralized state energy grid began failing, citizens and businesses didn't wait for regulatory permission, right? They simply bypassed the state by putting solar panels on their roofs.
They opted out of the grid, yeah.
Exactly. Crypto is the financial equivalent of rooftop solar. When the state mismanages the currency or imposes draconian exchange controls, citizens with technical literacy bypass the financial grid. This is about the laws of mathematics superseding the laws of the state.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. The solar panel analogy is vivid, I'll give you that, but it actually proves the exact opposite of your point.
How does it prove the opposite?
Because the state can see the solar panel on your roof. It exists in the physical world, so the state can tax it. They regulate the inverters. They mandate that the installation is certified by a state-approved electrician.
Okay, fair. But crypto isn't a physical panel.
No, but if you want to use your Bitcoin to buy a house or pay for groceries or invest in a local business, you eventually have to interact with the visible economy. The state only needs to regulate the authorized crypto asset service providers, the CASPs.
Like Valor and Luno?
Exactly. Platforms like Valor have to comply with the law. They report transactions. The chilling effect of severe punitive measures on the on-ramps and off-ramps of finance keeps the vast majority of capital exactly where the state wants it.
But you are assuming the end goal of holding Bitcoin is to constantly convert it back into state fiat currency through those regulated off-ramps. That fundamentally misunderstands the shift Amos is describing.
The shift away from fiat.
Right. The whole premise of the Bitcoin standard is that fiat currency, managed by central banks, inherently leads to the erosion of purchasing power. We see this historically with constant boom and bust cycles.
I mean, inflation is a well-documented issue.
Yes, and a departure from sound money principles always leads to economic instability. People aren't adopting this technology just to play regulatory arbitrage. They are holding it because it is fundamentally superior money, and the state itself knows its controls are failing.
You mean historical admissions?
Yeah, back in 2005, the South African Reserve Bank governor, Tito Mboweni, admitted that exchange controls had become purposeless and burdensome. In 1996, Nelson Mandela promised to scrap them entirely.
And yet, here we are in 2026, and the regulations are expanding, not shrinking.
Which just shows a profound desperation. The fact that the 2026 regulations include a mandatory repatriation rule, meaning they can force you to sell your crypto back into Rand if your original reason for buying it expires, shows they are trying to police information flows with analog tools that belong in the 20th century.
Okay, but if we are going to rely on Amos's framework that this is the ultimate flawless sound money, we have to look at the actual mechanics of the technology, because it is nowhere near as bulletproof as he suggests.
I mean, the Bitcoin network has never been hacked.
Sure. But Amos casually dismisses systemic architectural limitations. First, there is the scalability problem. Explain to me how a base layer network that maxes out at a handful of transactions per second is supposed to serve as a global, everyday medium of exchange.
Layer 2 networks.
But legacy networks like Visa are processing tens of thousands of transactions a second right now.
That is precisely why Layer 2 solutions like the Lightning Network were developed. You don't record every single coffee purchase on the base blockchain.
You take it off-chain.
Right. You process millions of microtransactions instantly off-chain, and you rely on the highly secure decentralized base layer for final settlement. It mirrors how central banking final settlement works, but, without the central bank.
Even with Layer 2 solutions, the friction of onboarding billions of people into self-custody is immense. But let's look at an even deeper technological vulnerability that threatens the very core of this sound money argument.
Let me guess, quantum computing?
Yes, quantum computing.
I mean, the quantum threat is, largely theoretical at this point.
It is theoretical until it isn't, and the timeline is accelerating. Bitcoin's security relies heavily on elliptic curve cryptography. A classical computer takes millions of years to guess a private key.
Because it guesses sequentially?
Exactly. But a quantum computer using Shor's algorithm doesn't guess sequentially. It can calculate and test possibilities simultaneously. The moment quantum processing scales, that mathematically secure vault you're relying on is blown wide open.
The network would just upgrade its encryption algorithms.
If they can reach consensus, which is politically messy. Furthermore, Amos's singular focus on Bitcoin is incredibly myopic. He dismisses the massive, diverse utility of the broader blockchain ecosystem, like smart contracts.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. I'm actually completely in favor of discussing smart contracts because they strengthen the argument against state control.
How so?
Because a smart contract is self-executing code. It isn't just a static digital asset, it is programmable money. If a government in an emerging market imposes a sudden, draconian exchange control to stop capital flight,
That the contract reacts?
exactly. It can be programmed to automatically route an individual's funds through a decentralized lending pool the exact second the local currency loses its peg against the dollar. It executes automatically, based on mathematical triggers, entirely outside of human jurisdiction.
But it's still running on physical infrastructure somewhere.
It lives on thousands of decentralized nodes. The state cannot subpoena a piece of code. That is exactly how technological reality outpaces legacy regulation.
Let's pivot here, because your argument relies heavily on a very specific philosophical assumption. It assumes that the ultimate goal for every human being is to become a financially isolated sovereign actor operating in a trustless environment.
Well, financial freedom is a pretty universal desire.
Is it? Or is this assumption that everyone wants to be their own central bank, a profoundly Western hyper-capitalist idea? This brings us to a critical piece of our source material regarding the cultural foundations of African economic development plans.
I don't really see how macroeconomic history invalidates cryptographic security.
It doesn't invalidate the cryptography. It challenges the sociological viability of the system you want to replace it with. If we look at the history of macroeconomic planning in Africa, we see a distinct pattern of failure. Take the Lagos Plan in action in 1980.
Right, which was built heavily on dependency theory.
Which essentially argued that developing nations were structurally disadvantaged by wealthy core nations. So the Lagos Plan argued that African states needed to forcefully disconnect from Western trade and build internal self-reliance through heavy state intervention.
A massive state-centric imposition.
Right. And then you jump to 2001 with NEPAD, the New Partnership for Africa's Development. This swung completely the other way into Western neoliberalism. The underlying premise there was deregulation, privatization, and reliance on the hyper-individualized, self-interested, rational actor.
And both of these sweeping macroeconomic plans failed to deliver.
They failed because they imported external frameworks that completely ignored local cultural realities and ontological frameworks. The academic texts point specifically to the Bantu concept of personhood, umuntu wa ubuntu.
The idea that identity is linked to the collective.
Exactly. In these societies, wealth, trust, and credit aren't isolated. They are deeply communal. Trust is built on shared, unwritten debt. I owe you, you owe me, and the community survives on this web of mutual obligation and human relationship.
And you are arguing that cryptocurrency threatens that?
I am arguing that if you introduce a radically individualized, mathematically trustless ledger into that environment, you aren't just modernizing finance. You are demanding that people stop trusting their neighbors and start trusting an algorithm. Imposing a universal crypto standard is just another version of importing an external framework and expecting it to miraculously overwrite cultural history.
That is a fascinating sociological angle, and I understand why you are drawing that parallel. But I have to push back hard on your conclusion.
Why is that?
The reason the Lagos plan and NetPad failed wasn't simply because they introduced foreign financial concepts. They failed because they were heavily centralized, top-down bureaucratic mandates imposed by political elites.
They relied on sprawling bureaucracies, yes.
Right, to dictate the flow of capital. What makes decentralized finance fundamentally different is that it is entirely bottoms-up.
But the ideology driving it, this anarcho-capitalist individualism, is still a specific cultural paradigm.
I don't agree that mathematics is culturally exclusive. Open source code is the most universally adaptable tool we have. Crypto does not impose a top-down macroeconomic plan on anyone. It is an opt-in protocol. Amartya Sen defines economic development as the expansion of human freedoms and the ability of people to lead the lives they value.
Okay, but how does that translate on the ground?
If an entrepreneur in Lagos or Johannesburg uses a stablecoin to bypass a 15% remittance fee imposed by legacy banks, or uses Bitcoin to protect their life savings from double-digit inflation caused by a failing central bank, they are not adopting a foreign cultural paradigm.
They're just surviving.
Exactly. They are exercising genuine, culturally adaptable agency. By giving individuals direct, uncensorable control over their wealth, crypto democratizes finance precisely because it removes the centralized gatekeepers that have historically mismanaged these economies.
I don't deny that crypto provides a powerful tool for individual agency, particularly in environments with weak fiat currencies. But you cannot wave away the reality of the state.
The state is losing its grip, though.
The state exists. It has borders, it has armies, it has tax requirements, and it has deep systemic inertia. When the South African Treasury drafts these 2026 regulations, they aren't just writing polite suggestions. They are asserting the primacy of the state over the individual.
Even if the rules are unenforceable?
You can call it archaic, you can call it a betrayal of Mandela's promises from the 90s, but it is the reality of how power functions. The transition to a Bitcoin standard requires a paradigm shift in economic thought that simply does not align with the self-preservation instincts of the nation-state.
Which brings us back to where we started. The state can write whatever it wants in the government gazette. It can threaten fines and mandate repatriations. But if the law is technologically unenforceable, it is just ink on paper.
It alters behavior, though.
But if a government demands the surrender of an asset that it cannot physically locate, and the citizen simply says, I lost my seed phrase, what does the state actually do at scale? The friction you were describing is real, but it is the friction of a dying system thrashing against a mathematical reality it cannot control.
I think you're underestimating their reach. Let's summarize where we stand, because I think the lines of our disagreement are incredibly clear.
Go ahead.
My position remains that while decentralized technology is undoubtedly disruptive, it must still contend with the immense regulatory and punitive power of the state.
The analog tools.
Exactly. And the technology itself has scalability limits and real vulnerabilities, like the horizon of quantum computing. More importantly, the ideology behind a trustless, borderless standard ignores the deeply ingrained institutional inertia and communal cultural context of human economies. The state will not simply evaporate. It will use its monopoly on physical coercion to regulate the visible on-ramps and off-ramps of this new system.
And my summary is that the technological reality of decentralized, mathematically secure money makes legacy state controls functionally obsolete. Attempts to regulate a borderless digital protocol like a physical asset represent a profound misunderstanding of how the technology operates.
You see it as unstoppable.
I do. Whether through Layer 2 networks or automated smart contracts, crypto provides a bottom-up tool that expands human freedom. It offers true sound money that protects individuals from the mismanagement of centralized state planning, and honestly, no amount of government drafting can reverse a mathematical breakthrough.
We might not agree on the ultimate victor, but it is impossible to deny that the friction we are seeing, epitomized by those South African Treasury regulations, marks a critical, messy transition period in the evolution of money.
On that, we are in complete alignment. Evaluating these emerging systems requires us to look far beyond just the cryptographic code.
Right. We have to understand historical inertia, the brutal realities of state power, and the complex psychological and cultural behaviors of the human beings actually using the technology.
Yeah, it is truly fascinating to observe how cutting-edge mathematics collides with deeply entrenched human institutions. There is so much more to explore in the source material regarding the future of sovereignty, the nature of money, and how societies develop and resist control.
Absolutely.
But we will leave it to the listener to decide which force, the unstoppable algorithm or the immovable state, will ultimately shape the future of our wealth. As we sign off, just think back to that customs officer at the border checkpoint, searching through a physical suitcase, while millions in digital value silently beam past them in the ether. Thanks for joining us on The Debate.